Hey, I'm Andrew Owen. This is Destiny, and I'm so glad that you've been able to join with me today as we continue our assignment on discovering I shall not want. A look at the 23rd Psalm. This is perhaps the most famous of all Psalms, possibly the most famous piece of scripture anywhere. And we're unpacking great truth from it. We've already discovered that King David wrote this psalm at the end of his life, and he was kind of giving an explanation as to the reason for his success. You know, when people are successful, they do the television interviews, they write their biographies or autobiographies. People want to be mentored by them. They're invited to the universities to tell us how you did it. Well, here's David doing just that. He's telling us how he did it. And he's explaining the real reason. I've got the best form of leadership ever known to man working in my life, called shepherding. It was common in those days for the king of the nation to be called the shepherd. And David was referred to as the great shepherd of Israel. But he kept saying, behind this throne, there's a big leader, and I've got a personal relationship with him. You see, God is knowable. Today, I want to talk about this concept of being comforted. What does that mean to you? Being comforted. Maybe you remember a moment as a child you fell over and your mum, your dad, and uncle picked you up and comforted you. Maybe you've had bad news and someone's trying to console you. But comforting can take on a whole different dimension than that. Let's just have a look at this verse. The 23rd Psalm, and I'm reading the 4th verse. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. Wow, isn't that a bold statement? For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. There's so many important things to see just in this one verse. The first is this: even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, this was not meant to be a permanent destination. It was simply meant to be a place through which you passed. It's probably the reason why this psalm is most read at funerals, because of this reference. But David actually had something completely different in mind when he coined it. Apparently, in the districts and in the wildernesses and the deserts where he lived, there were high mountains and deep valleys. And a shepherd, and he's probably talking from his own experience early on as a shepherd, he would lead his sheep to find some new green fields, and sometimes they'd have to go down into the bottom of the valley and then up again before they could find that green grass. Well, in the shadows of the cliff, the places where the sun hardly ever got through, the predators would often hang out, hoping to pick off the less suspecting, those who were not being watched or wary about all that was going on. And David probably thought about those moments as a young shepherd, but he also could identify with many, many chapters in his life where it felt like he was going through a deep valley, where there was no hope. But you know what? There was hope, because he came through it. So hey, don't go setting up a home, a permanent camp in a place that you're only meant to pass through. Too many of us find identity from our pain, we find identity from our shortcomings or our failures, and forever thereafter, we identify ourselves with that. We've taken up home in the valley of the shadow of death. We define ourselves by that experience. But that's not the way it's meant to be. You're meant to pass through it. And we learned in an earlier series right here that when we face challenges, valley experiences, and they can be severe, they can be valley of death experiences, we might think we're done here. Listen, God is only after one thing: your faith. He wants your faith to move in that situation. Peter, in his epistle, explains this to us fully about the reason for pressures and trials and tribulations. he says that it might pull out your faith, which is considered precious. James writes the same thing in his epistle. He says this, count it pure joy when you face trials of various kinds. When you're in that valley that feels like the valley of the shadow, count it pure joy. You go, why would I want to do that? How could I possibly count this as pure joy? Because God's put inside you an entity called faith that connects with him, that when you start using that faith, you will come through victorious. James writes and he says, count it pure joy when you face trials of various kinds, and concludes it by saying, for then you will be complete, lacking in nothing. Lacking in nothing. You'll come through. And so David had gone through many valley experiences. And as he came through them, he knew something significant was happening in all of this. He was first able to say, God's not left me. You may feel you're in a valley and you may want to ask the question, where is God? He's right there with you in it. He hasn't gone anywhere. He's committed to you. The secret to this psalm is verse 6. Surely goodness and mercy, chesed love, shall follow me all the days of my life. God never, ever lets go. And when you put your faith in that, you're putting your faith in this shepherd who's taken a hold of you and will walk you through it. If that's your confidence, I promise you that those things will disappear. Let me tell you something else. Life is life. It has valleys in it. There is no doubt. You can't live on top of a mountain permanently, constantly. But listen, what makes life great is not the absence of a shadow, but the presence of a shepherd. So when the shadows fall, you know my shepherd is right here with me. So don't be discouraged when you face those things. The shadow is not really the issue. The real issue is you got a shepherd to lead you through it the whole way and bring you out the other side. Notice the bold statement David made in this psalm. He said, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Notice that's a choice he makes. I will fear not. How many of us are prone to fear, anxiety, leading then to stress and worry? How will we ever come out and through this? My mother used to be like that. She's going to be with the Lord right now. And she had just an awesome testimony at the end of her life, how God engaged with her so many times. But as she began a Christian journey, she began it as a worrier. And I remember one day she came to stay with us, and she stayed several weeks, and then we took her home to a home where at that time she lived on her own, and the post had piled up behind the door. So she picks up all the letters, and there's a brown envelope, and she goes, oh dear. I went, what? It's a bill. Then she sat down in a chair and she put her head in her hands. I'll never be able to pay it. How am I going to manage this? She hadn't even opened it. That was a default position. And I said, for goodness sake, you don't even know what it is. Open it. So when she opened it, she actually found it was a check, a rebate from something she'd overpaid. She learned later on how good God was, and she had miraculous stories to tell. But isn't that our default position so often? We fear. There's a famous book in the Bible, Job, and the story of Job. There's a 6-month period where Job loses everything. But Job gives us the explanation for why that loss happened. This is what he says. Out of his own mouth, he says, that which I feared came upon me. Fear is as powerful as faith. It just takes you into the dark side. It just takes you into negativity. It just creates that shadowy valley world. But when we're entering into it, we need to be like David. I'm not going to fear. I'm not going to allow this thing to get a hold of my life. Rather, I'm going to trust God, my shepherd. It's not the absence of shadows that's going to make a difference. It's the presence of a shepherd that's going to make a difference. And then he goes on to say, notice this, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Isn't that an unusual thing to say? A few years back, we had the privilege and the opportunity to be a part of a very, very large crusade in the Congo, in Africa. And we went to an area, a community called Mujimai, which had been a war zone and was still a very, very volatile place to be. We rode permanently in a four-wheel drive car with armed guards sitting on the spare wheel and on the roof with AK-47s. And when we slept in our little house at night in this compound, they, with their AK-47s, slept outside our door. I guess you could say they comforted us. We felt safe knowing that these guys were around when we were in the middle of all of this area. When David said, "Your rod and your staff, they comfort me," he was fully aware that God, as far as he was concerned, was not a placid, indifferent spectator playing with lives, but he was a shepherd who was determined to protect, engage, interfere, and watch over. And if necessary, take action without any shadow of a doubt. He was confident that God would step in. And do you know what? As we journey through life, I want you to be sure that whatever's facing you, wherever you're in that valley, you can be comforted, not just simply with soft, gentle words saying, there, it's going to be fine, but with the military, militant prowess of an active God of the angel armies engaging with you. How does he do that? How would he do that for me as a Christian today? Well, here's a few things. Have you ever noticed that in Ephesians, where we read about the armor of God, Paul writes and he says, having done all, stand. I think at the bottom line there, Paul, who also understood covenant, one of our great themes in this study, he also understood chesed. He also understood agape. God is for me. I think when he was saying, having done all, stand, and again I say to you, stand, I think he was saying, stand in this covenant love. Stand in this relationship. The devil will do all that he can to knock you off it. He will tell you that God has left you. He will tell you you've messed up. He will tell you there's no hope. But you determine, no, I'm going to stand here. And then he says, put on the full armor of God. Notice how he words that. He doesn't even say put on God's armor that he's given to you. He says put on the full armor of God. The implication is the very things that God himself uses, you have. You have available to you. And in the same way that David was saying, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. We have an arsenal that we can use with God himself to come through every situation. The shepherds of old, the likes of which David once was, had become proficient in certain things. David was proficient with a sling and he was proficient with a staff. He could throw that thing and hit some creature, some lion, some bear, and send it running. But God has this might that he wants to engage with us in. And the Bible says, put on the full armor of God. I remember watching movies as a youngster. You know, remember those knights in shining armor? They'd come out to do battle or jousting. They'd be dressed from head to foot. You don't know who's inside that. All you can see is the armor. Well, when you dress up in that armor, the devil doesn't know who's inside that. As far as he's concerned, you look like God himself. You can walk that way through the situation. And God prepares you to come at it. No, I'm coming through this. Sometimes I encourage my leaders that they need to develop what I would call a contending spirit. I don't mean a contentious spirit. You see, a contentious spirit is when you fall out with everybody in anything. But a contending spirit takes the position, I'm coming through this. We're going to work our way through this, and God's with me. I'm going to contend with this. I'm going to press in on this. That's what faith does. I have a funny story. We once, as a church and a ministry, found ourselves in a big dispute with a major bank. They had clearly done something which was illegal and unrighteous. And we began to fight our corner and fight our corner and fight our corner to the point where two directors from this bank came to see me personally. And they sat down in my office being as bullish and as intimidating as they could possibly be. They were not interested in the morality of the situation. They weren't interested in what was right or wrong. They simply said this to me: for every lawyer you get, we'll get 10. And don't you know that our pockets are far, far deeper than your pockets? So if you want to fight, you go for it. And then out of their mouths came these words: we want you to know, we are Goliath, you are David. And I think they thought they were being clever by throwing in a spiritual metaphor to a pastor. The moment they said that, I just stopped and smiled. I said, you do know how that story ended. David took out Goliath. And do you know what? After 4 years, we won a major victory against that bank without spending one penny at a lawyer's office. We received hundreds of thousands of pounds in compensation, and our contracts were put back the way they should have been. And personnel inside that major bank were fired. We won. We turned to lawyers. They said, this situation is so complex, few of us understand it. But God understood it. We were in a valley, and we came through it. We developed a contending spirit which said, I'm not stopping here. We're coming through. And when you develop that contending spirit, believing, God is with me, I'm going to put on that full armor of God. Remember what some of those things were? The breastplate of righteousness. See, the first thing the enemy wants to do is to tell you that when you're in a valley, you deserve it. It's your own fault. He will magnify all your shortcomings, and he will tell you that you haven't got a hope of God answering your prayers. And it would be true if God was answering prayers by my performance ability. But I remind him, I'm not standing here in my righteousness. I'm standing here in his righteousness. And because his righteousness has been given to me as my gift, then God must respond to my request. Because there was a time when my covenant representative, Jesus, took on the covenant marks on his body and stood before God Almighty and said, all that's yours is theirs. I take the sword of the Spirit, the word of God, the shield of faith, and I contend with this thing, knowing that God's comforting me the whole way through this. David was able to say, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Isn't that an interesting thing that when you look at the Bible, many of those Old Testament characters in particular walk their walks with sticks in their hand. Remember Moses? When he opened the Red Sea, what did God say to him? He said, raise up your staff, Moses. So he lifts the stick and the seas part before him. Even before that, he'd walked into Pharaoh's courts with his staff. And Pharaoh's magicians threw their staffs down, which turned to snakes, apparently. Moses did the same, and his staff-turning snake swallowed up all those other snakes, and he picked it back up again. All too often, we find this staff, this stick, appearing all the way through the Old Testament, people carrying their sticks with them. I'm told, and I'm well informed, that in the days that these personalities and these characters lived, the staff became their personal journal and diary. They would mark on those sticks great events of their life. They would notch in when children were born. They would notch in when people came into their lives or great experiences happened to them. So the staff became a permanent diary. It became a permanent autobiography of a life. So when David says, your rod and your staff, they comfort me, I think David had in mind, God, I've been through many valleys in my life, but in each and every one of them, no matter what kind of valley they were, it wasn't the shadow that made the difference. It was the presence of a shepherd that made a difference. And I'm able to look back at my staff, and I'm able to say, right there, when I was hiding in Abdullam's cave, you helped me, God. Right there, when my wife and children were taken hostage, you helped me there. Right there, when Saul tried to kill me, you helped me right there. And God, even on this one, when I failed and I messed up big time and it looked like I had blown it, you still helped me there. Your chesed, covenant love, your grace, it kept coming towards me. I have this stuff. I have these memories. I know you are faithful. I know you are good. You have stood beside me this whole time. You've comforted me. And you see, all too often, all the moments when we've experienced God, they build a substantial case of conviction in our lives that God's not going to change now. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. God comforts us. He steps in with a memory of past interventions, breakthroughs, and achievements. And we realize, same God. It's not the presence of a shadow that makes the difference. It's the presence of the shepherd that makes the difference. He comforts me. We can talk about comforting in different ways. You see, sometimes being comforted happens when new information comes our way. It's possible that you've been to a doctor, been to a bank manager, been somewhere, and they've given you devastating information. They may have just said, there's nothing we can do. They may just have said, we're foreclosing. Talk about discomfort. That is the moment you feel it. But all too often, God will comfort you. He will change that situation when He brings new information into it that you didn't otherwise know. That new information can change everything. Everything. A long time ago, my grandfather, my grandmother lived on a very small farm on top of the Black Mountains in South Wales, and they'd worked hard for many years, carving out a living, looking after a very large family of kids, 12 kids. And they rented this farm. They paid it once a year on January the 1st, and a landlord would turn up, wish them Happy New Year, hope they'd had a good Christmas, and collect the rent for the 12 months. Then they'd see him again the next year. This apparently went on for many years. Then one day, my grandfather was getting older. He thought, I'm not going to be able to farm this much more. He'd fallen behind with his rent. He began to stress and worry about it, how he was going to pay it now. His kids were growing up. They thought they'd start helping if they could, but they were a very poor family. And then one day, my grandfather was walking through the village, and in a chance conversation by someone who used to live in this village many years ago, but now had returned, and they were just visiting folks, he received this information, which went like this. The landlord who'd been collecting the rent actually didn't own the land. And of course, in those days, few people used lawyers, and there was no contracts. It was all word of mouth. Well, he went to check this thing out and discovered that most of the land he'd been using had been what they'd called common land. It was owned by no one. But yet this man, this landlord, had pretended that it had and had exacted a rent to which he was not owed, and it was not due. My grandfather, of course, went from despair as to how am I going to pay it to the place of righteous indignation. I've been paying this guy money and he doesn't even own the property on which I'm living. You see, new information changed the whole situation. And as well-meaning as the professionals may be in our world, I promise you, they do not have the last word in everything because they don't know everything. But there is a shepherd who actually does know everything. He's eternal. He knows the end from the beginning and the beginning from the end. That's why David was able to say, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. And when it came to challenges, Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil. He's with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And just like a shepherd would throw a rod into the situation, you can throw a word into the situation and it changes everything. In fact, Jesus did just that when he was tempted by Satan himself in the wilderness. You can read the account in Luke 4. And when you come to it, you discover that Jesus, having fasted 40 days, was severely hungry, and the devil came and tempted him. And of course, that first temptation was, if you are the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. And Jesus' reply was, he threw in the word, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. He threw in the word, like the shepherd would throw in the rod. You see, God comforts you by throwing the word into the situation. It changes everything. Concerning that temptation of Jesus, we would read that and naturally think it was all about food, in that Jesus was hungry. He'd fasted for 40 days. And the devil said to him, if you're the Son of God, turn these stones into bread, satisfy your hunger. Jesus refused to satisfy his hunger. Not at all like Adam and Eve, who when tempted to eat, ate of the fruit. The first Adam failed, but Jesus, this our last Adam, he refused to eat and didn't fail. He succeeded. But I would suggest to you that the real temptation was this. Satan said to Jesus, if you are the Son of God, prove it. Give me a miracle here. Let's see something happen. And when you read the account, of course, Jesus had just been at his baptism 40 days earlier when an audible voice came out from heaven, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. So the devil didn't challenge what he was able to do, he challenged his identity. I need to tell you today, the darkest valley that you will walk is a self-crisis identity. Who am I? So often we think we're worth nothing, but God is so for us. He will bring you through that valley. You throw in the word, just like Jesus threw in the word. You say, no, I'm a child of God. My shepherd's bringing me through. You see, it's not the absence of a shadow. It's the presence of a shepherd that makes the whole difference. I think these truths are amazing. They really do comfort us. I'm Andrew Owen. This is destiny. You have a destiny. I'm really praying that you're going to find it, that you're going to know this shepherd too. Till next time, God bless you.